Today, the title of the message is Grit, Slaying Giants. And so I am taking the next step with you in the life of David, and I am preaching a very, very familiar passage to many of you. As a matter of fact, it's so familiar that this is the third time that David slaying Goliath will be preached from this platform in 2023. Pastor Chad did it on a Wednesday night, Pastor Anthony Daly a few Wednesday nights ago, and admittedly, I was a little hesitant to preach it again today because I didn't want to be redundant. But there is a difference between redundance and repetition. And I believe that this is repetition this morning. I believe the Lord has something that He wants to say to us. How many of you are familiar with David and Goliath? I mean, even if you've not been churched, you've heard it as a cultural marker, that it's this David and Goliath, the underdog versus the threat. And even passages like this, they're tough to preach because if you've heard it and you've heard it over and over again, a lot of sermons, you've watched a movie or two, you've read a book or two, it's really easy to check out. Well, I've heard this before. What else is there to say? But I want you to know that God has something to say. And it's possible to have intellectual notches in your belt, but it not yet have reached revelation, life-changing status in your heart. And so my hope is for some of us today that something that is familiar will become explosive in our spirit as we navigate the terrain around us. But before we get to that, go ahead and tell the people around you, you don't know everything. So go ahead and let them know. Hey, you can tell 2 or 3 of them. Hey, this is a guaranteed fact right here. You ain't lying. You don't know everything. And so today, hang with me, knowing that we don't know everything. This series, Grit, the overarching premise is that God has plans for your life. That God has divine intentions for you, that there are promises from heaven attached to you. Before your parents met, before your grandpa took your grandma in a ride in the Gremlin, God already knew what He wanted to do in your life, right? God intended for you to hit certain markers along the way. As a matter of fact, it says in Ephesians 2:10, for we are God's masterpiece. Go ahead and say, I'm His masterpiece. We are God's masterpiece, and He has created us anew in Christ so we can do the good things or good works that He planned for us long ago. That there were things that He planned before you were born. As you were being knit together in your mother's womb, He had ideas for your life. Now, to get there, a lot of times what is required is a measure of grit and determination. But when I say grit, I'm not talking about rub some dirt on it, suck it up, get over it. That's not what I'm saying. What real grit is the determination to fight for your heart. Real grit is strength of character and conviction. The conviction to know this is right and I'm going to do it no matter what. Grit is an enduring faith. The willingness to hold on however long it takes. Grit is holding on to a sound mind in the chaos of everything that is crowding your thoughts. I'm going to fight and hold on for a sound mind. Grit is that in my brokenness will not turn to bitterness. That's grit right there. I might be broken, but I refuse to be bitter. Grit is that no matter what, I know God looks at the heart, and I want to fight to have a pure heart, a right heart, a healthy heart. Right? How many of you guarded your heart this past week? Some of you, that message last week probably got on your nerves through this week. I'm sorry for messing with you. Not really. Last week was a little intrusive. It was a little invasive. This week I'm hoping will be encouraging and inspiring. I'm hoping that this week will put some steel in our backbone. I'm hoping that this week will forge within us a new resolve that what God has planned for us, we will see with our eyes and we will hold with our hands. Before we move forward, I want to read from 2 Chronicles 16:9. This is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. For real. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the earth, to show himself strong on behalf of those whose hearts are loyal to him. God is scanning the globe, and he's not looking for the bad and saying, well, there's bad stuff, I can't move. I can't do anything because of the bad. He's looking for hearts that belong to him. And when he finds a heart that belongs to him, when he finds a heart that is loyal, committed, devoted, and completely his, then he moves on that heart and shows his strength through that person. When he sees a heart that is locked in with him, he finds within that heart a conduit through which he can manifest his great power in the world. I want to be that heart. When God is looking across the planet, I want him to stop with me and say, there's something in that boy right there that I can flex through. When you guard your heart, you become that person that God stops and says, okay, I'm going to show my strength in the middle of all of the weakness in the world. And so that's what we see in David's life as he faces a giant. God showing his strength through a heart that is committed to him. Not a perfect heart, not a precise heart, but a heart that belongs to the Lord. And so I want to read the text, even if it's familiar to some of us. And I want you to just hang, because remember, I don't know everything, right? And we're just going to lift some different notes off of the page today. 1 Samuel 17, 3 through 9, and verse 16. So the Philistines and the Israelites faced each other on opposite hills. One on one elevated hill, the other on the opposite elevated hill, with a valley between them. Say a valley. Then Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. That's tall. Shaquille O'Neal's like 7'2". He's bigger than Shaquille O'Neal. He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. That's about how much I weigh. This man was carrying me around like it was nothing. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of the spear was as heavy as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. We're just getting the resume of the enemy right here. It's impressive, if you will. Verse 8, Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. Why are you all coming out to fight? He called. I'm the Philistine champion, but you're only the servants of Saul. Choose one, say one. Choose one man to come down here, say down here, and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. For 40 days, every morning, say morning, and evening, say evening, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelite army. Lord, you're with us today. You're here in strength and in power. And I ask that over the next few moments, Holy Spirit, you would fill this room with yourself. Because you are our great encourager. You are the one that has all wisdom and knowledge. I pray that today that you would lift our spirits. I pray today that you would do miracles in this room. I ask that when we get to the conclusion of this, that you would break chains, that you would slay giants, that you would shift circumstances, that you would move on behalf of your precious people. And I pray that you'd help me today to embody your heart as I talk. In the name of Jesus, we all said yes, right? So there was a giant taunting God's people. He was strutting about, if you will. He was defiantly challenging God's people. He was arrogantly scoffing at them. He was puffing himself up to intimidate, to fester insecurity and anxiety in the people of God. And he was heavily armored. He was well weaponized. He had quite the resume. He was a champion. He was wanting everybody to know that he was accomplished, he was capable. And then on top of that, he was trying to single someone out. He wanted to call one person from an elevated position down into the valley with him so that the person would be isolated, singular, alone, down in the gutter with him. We learned from a few weeks ago when Pastor Anthony preached on a Wednesday night that it isn't circumstance that the giant showed up in the morning and in the evening, because that was the prescribed time of worship for Israel. So the enemy, Goliath, would come out and he would start taunting and intimidating and scoffing at the time when the people of God should have been directing their focus on the Lord and expressing their love and appreciation to God. So the enemy would come and try to distract them. They'd get to the end of the day when they should be thanking God for His faithfulness and how He got them through another day. Yet here comes the enemy to divert their focus from God Almighty into their adversary's focus. An enemy that had a real strategy. I don't know if you know what it's like to deal with the giant. Has anybody ever dealt with the giant? Hey, let's get Goliath out of our mind. Have you ever dealt with opposition? Have you ever dealt with an adversary? Have you ever dealt with an obstacle? Does anybody in the room know what I'm talking about? Something that was impeding your progress. I don't know if anybody in the room has ever dealt with something that was trying to intimidate or harass. And it can come in a lot of forms. It could be a societal giant like greed or perversion or violence. It can be a familial giant, something in your family that's a trend, a trait that seems to be reoccurring, and it always rears its head at inopportune moments in your life. It could be an internal giant, something in your thought life that creeps in over and over. You get right on the edge of a breakthrough and these thoughts bombard you, or in your emotions, your soul seems to always wrestle with the same adversary and obstacle. It could be a circumstantial giant. All of the situations of your life have lined up and you are dealing with something that's creating a lot of stress. I don't know if anybody knows what stress feels like. You're dealing with something that is pressing against you and feels weighty upon you, and you're looking at it and it's ominous and it's overwhelming and you're not real sure how things are going to work out. Something that wants to taunt you, to challenge you, to scoff at you, to intimidate you, to instill doubt or fear in you. Something that feels unbeatable. I've been dealing with this so long, I guess I'm just going to have to accept this is my lot in life. Something that feels so impossible, yet we just sang a moment ago, He's a God with whom everything is possible. Yeah, go ahead, lead us in that clap. I don't know if you're going through that now or if you have been through. My suspicion is everybody has met a roadblock. Everybody has met an obstacle. Everybody has dealt with some opposition along the way. And what it'll often try to do is single you out. It'll try to make you feel isolated and alone, and it will drag you from elevated places into valleys of the soul and spirit, trying to overshadow you with doubt. The enemy's tactics are pretty much the same over and over and over again. He wants to intimidate us. He wants to impose fear. He wants you to feel isolated. He wants you to feel like nobody understands or nobody gets it or nobody can really help you. He wants you to be covered in loneliness. He wants to pull you into sorrow of the soul or angst of the soul, and he wants to harass you as long as possible. He wants it to last as long as it can possibly last. 40 days he just keeps coming out and just taunting and intimidating. That's the ploy of the enemy. But there's some folks in Cornerstone today that say enough is enough. There's some people in Cornerstone today that say, I ain't having it no more. There's some folks in this church right now that have made the determination in their heart, this is the last day that I shrink in terror. This is the last day that I retreat in fear. From this point forward, these giants, these adversaries, these obstacles are not going to get the victory over me because I'm living in some victory. There's some folks in Cornerstone that refuse to take their eyes off the Lord. There's some people in this room that whatever delay you're dealing with, whatever impediment, whatever isolation the enemy is trying to bring you in, I still got a song in my heart. The enemy might be trying to pull my eyes off of the Lord, but I am determined in the morning when I rise before anything has happened that I'm going to bless the Lord for everything that's coming. And when I lie my head down at the end of the day, no matter what in the world I went through, a song of thanksgiving is going to rise up out of my lungs because God has gotten me to my bed safe and sound. There's got to be something that happens in us. That's why the enemy wants your worship, because he wants your focus off of the one who can get you out of this. He wants your mind to be distracted from the King who has authority over all things. But these folks in Cornerstone that I'm coming to know are people that will not let their song be stolen, will not let their lips be silent. There's something in you that says, the Lord is my help in times of trouble. I can look to the hills and Lord, I know that you are coming. God, you are faithful through the generations. Surely goodness and mercy have followed me all the days of my life. You are Jireh, my provider. You are Nisi, the banner over me. You are the healer, Lord. You have provided. I wish somebody in this room would get your eyes off your giant right now. Come on, something real from in here. We bless you, Lord, because you've come through for us. Lord, you were there when we woke up and you'll be there when we lie down. Lord, you are the Holy One of Israel. There is none who are greater than you. You're all powerful. You're the God of the impossible. You're the God of the breakthrough. You're the God who delivers me. You took them out of Egypt. You parted a Red Sea. You sent fire down on a mountain. You sent your son and you moved the rock. Lord, you've done it before. You're faithful in every way, and I'll keep worshiping you and I'll keep praising you. Something's got to rise up on the inside. I got lost for a minute there. I'm sorry. Something's got to happen on the inside of us. Because the enemy wants that. He wants to stop your song. He wants to stop your worship. Because if he can get your eyes off the Lord and his resume onto the enemy's resume, the enemy, we see around us all that the enemy's done. And if you're not careful, you'll start believing the resume of the enemy more than you believe the resume of the Lord. But your worship reminds your soul and spirit, no, God has the resume. God is the victor. So whatever happens, don't ever let your worship stop. Whatever happens, don't stop praising. So it's not just some superfluous part of the service that we do as a form and formality. It is a way of life day in and day out. My life is like incense rising before the Lord day and night and day. I'm not taking my eyes off him. You all right? There's some folks that know God's already promised them a victory. God has promised them blessing. God has promised you joy and dancing. God has promised you a feast. He has promised you health. He's promised you reconciliation. He's promised you freedom. He's promised you recovery. So let's get to it, right? So let's read the end of the narrative. Verses 41 through 51. Goliath walked out toward David with his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy. Am I a dog, he roared at David, that you come at me with a stick? And he cursed David by the names of his gods. David replied to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, spear, and javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies. Come on, somebody. The God of the armies of Israel, who you have defied. Just make a note. We're coming back to that. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I'll kill you and cut off your head. That's kind of violent. But it's in there. I'm just reading what's in there. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. Which way did David run? toward the giant. We need some folks that'll run toward it, not run from it. Reaching into his shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. Then David ran over and pulled Goliath's sword from its sheath, and David used it to kill him and cut off his head. Again, brutal. You know, I hope when they teach this in kids' church that they, tone it down a little bit. I want to spend the rest of our time together highlighting the necessary grit that we must muster in order to conquer the giants, the adversaries, the opposition that comes our way. I want us for the next little bit to be renewed in our mind, to develop a thought process that will help us every single time the enemy stands up, struts, taunts, and intimidates in our life. It's inevitable. If you're not facing a giant, you will eventually. So whether you're in the middle of it or not, just know this is valuable to us. So 4 displays of grit needed to conquer giants. Number 1, where there is a giant, there are spoils to be won. As we read the account, David shows up. He's bringing lunch to his brothers. His dad sent him. He hears the giant doing his thing, and he starts asking questions like, what's going on? He starts having conversation with different soldiers. And come to find out, the king has offered something to a champion. This is what it says in verse 25. The king has offered a huge reward. Say huge reward. To anyone who kills him. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes. You talk about a reward, you get a wife and no more taxes. You can win a lot of elections that way. To the person who wins, you get a great reward. One of my favorite worship artists is a guy named Jason Upton. And I've shared this before on the podcast, and I can't remember if I have in a service before other than an hour or two ago. But Jason Upton, he wrote a song several years ago called Scarecrow. And the implied idea was this. You're driving through the countryside and you see a garden, a large field, and you see a scarecrow in there. How many of you have ever driven by and seen a scarecrow with crows or birds resting on it? It's kind of comical, right? So the idea of the song is this. If I were a foolish bird and I were flying and I saw a scarecrow, I would fly away from the scarecrow. But if I was a wise bird, I would see the scarecrow and know that the scarecrow indicates there is a treasure in the field. The sign of something scary is evidence that there is something for me to feast on right there. The visual, the opposition, the obstacle, the impediment, the thing that is harassing me is evidence that there is a bounty awaiting me, that there are spoils that are accessible to me. And sometimes when you are looking at an enemy, it's good to just kind of peer around the corner and remind yourself that on the other side, God has a promise waiting for me. God has blessing waiting for me. He's got something. So when you're dealing with stuff, your thoughts get attacked. Your emotions get attacked. Your energy is affected. You become less passionate. Your drive is diminished. And the enemy is trying to stifle you in all ways. I don't know how you react. When I get stressed, and this is just a moment of honesty here, my unhealthy way of responding to stress and pressure and attack is I tend to retract into reclusion. Like if I'm feeling stress and pressure, my unhealthy response is to start isolating myself. I don't want to talk to people. I don't want to interact with people. And then on top of that, I'll start looking for diversions. Like, I'll just look for as many distractions as I can. Entertainment, just activity that's not really relevant or important, but something to take my mind off of that. The problem is, neither one of those are attached to my purpose. When I retract from people, I am retracting from my purpose, which is intrinsically tied to people. When I sink into diversion, I am taking my focus and diminishing it, and my focus is needed for me to operate in God's purpose for my life. All of us have these default settings, these unhealthy responses when stress, pressure, opposition, and adversary comes. It's good to know yours, but it's also good to know that I've got to contend against that. If I'm feeling the weight of the world, I do not sink into seclusion. I interact with the body because that's what's good for me. I don't try to divert myself. I dial in my focus. I'm not going to handle this the way my flesh wants to handle this. I'm going to push forward. They show up to try to, these giants, to try to sink us into the lesser version of ourselves. Because if the enemy can do that, he can keep us from the spoils. Your enemy is unceasingly attempting to delay, deter, discourage, distract, dismay, dishearten, disillusion, and distress. That's some alliteration right there. That's what the enemy is always trying to do. So when that comes at you, you got to grab your faith and you got to shift it in the right direction. You got to know that when that's coming against you, no, I am buffeting myself against it because it's a sign that the enemy is trying to keep me from something that rightfully belongs to me. The enemy is trying to keep me from something that God plans for me to take hold of. I love what David did. He ran toward the battle. He ran toward the opposition. He didn't move the opposite way. He didn't try to get out. He went after it. Can I just tell you, if you're going to get what God intends for you to have in life, you can't shrink from battle. You can't shrink from the adversary. You got to go toward it and take it head on. That guy was out there 40 days because nobody went at him. It'll last until you go at it. It'll stay until you're determined, I'm not running from it. James says in the first chapter of his epistle, something that many of you are probably familiar with. He says, "Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy." You got to see opposition as opportunity. You got to see what opposes you as opportune. For you know that when your faith, y'all's quiet on that, by the way. I know this is hard to swallow. It's an oxymoron. You're telling me to have, which is a fun word to say, by the way, because you get to say moron. You're telling me to be happy when stuff's going bad. Well, it's all about your mindset. It's about knowing that there are spoils when there's a battle. When your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. Verse 4, so let it grow. Say, let it grow. Let it grow. Let the thing that God is trying to do in your heart, let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you'll be perfect and complete, needing nothing. Let it grow. Let God strengthen you. If nothing else, what you'll get out of going through a battle, what you'll get out of facing a giant, when you get to the other side, is a deeper knowledge of God, a greater revelation of His faithfulness, a more firm belief that He is capable of coming through. And really, that is the greatest spoils, that my heart has expanded in faith and belief in my God. And so you just know, I'm going through it, but there is spoils to be won. The second display of grit that's needed is you don't listen to the accusations. So David is asking questions to everybody. He's trying to figure out what's going on, and then his oldest brother speaks up, and this is what he says. When David's oldest brother Eliab heard David talking to the men, he was angry. What are you doing here anyway? What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle. So his brother accuses, he makes an accusation against his significance. Who do you think you are? You just handle those little nothing sheep. He makes an accusation against his significance, and he makes an accusation against his heart. You got pride, you're full of deceit. It's a pretty strong thing for a brother to do, but I don't want you to get distracted by Eliab here, because the enemy is identified as the accuser of the brethren. The enemy is forever whispering accusation against your heart in hopes that you will believe the lie about yourself. And so when you are facing difficulty, one of his tactics is to whisper inaccuracies to your soul and to your spirit. So these accusations come in a lot of different forms. Maybe it's something like this: you deserve this difficulty. You earn this. You don't deserve God's promises because you haven't been good enough. You're not capable of surviving this. You don't have the necessary intellect or talent or resources to get out of this. Why would God help you? You got yourself into this mess. Or we say stuff to ourselves like, I haven't read the Word enough, I'm not spiritual enough, I've not gone to church enough. We'll say things like, I haven't done enough to earn the victory. I'm lacking in some way. You got to recognize the deception of the enemy. You got to know when it's not God talking to you and it's something else. You got to be attuned to the fact that when you're going through it, there are going to be a whole lot of lies from the enemy flowing through your mind and through your heart that you got to figure out how to filter, take a hold of, cast out. We wrote the book, Let Your Heart Go Free, a few years ago. And it's my first book, and I intend to write 10 to 20 of them. I've got a second one written, but I'm just waiting on the Lord to tell me to release it because I'm more concerned with pastoring this church than writing books right now. But I know that that's a part of the assignment on my life. But the first book was really hard. It wasn't hard to write, but the actual process of publishing it and releasing it was really hard. Because I was really concerned that I was doing it for the wrong reasons. Like, am I being prideful? Is this selfish ambition? Am I being self-centered? And then these secondary thoughts of, who do I think I am to write a book? I'm, 40 years old at the time. Who do I think I am to try to tell people? I mean, my goodness, I'm every summer in a hot gym in the middle of nowhere in Goodlettsville where you don't even have good cell service with a bunch of teenagers. Who am I to tell anybody how to live? And I was really wrestling with it. And I could take you to the spot in our house one day where Michelle just spoke wisdom. She said, it would be like the enemy to use your desire for humility against you. To take a noble desire and manipulate it and twist it to slow you up. The enemy will use whatever he can. He'll take your most noble intentions and he will try to contort them to hold you up and cause you to be locked up in God's plans for your life. So how did David respond to the accusation? Well, first he said, what have I done now? My gosh. And then the Bible says that he moved on. He kept asking folks, what do you do when the accusations come from the enemy? You just keep moving. When the enemy is trying to lie in your heart, you keep moving. You do not acknowledge it. You don't listen to it. You don't meditate on it. You don't stew on it. You don't worry about it. You just keep pushing forward, moving. And if you'll keep moving, those voices will be silent. The third display of grit is you need to recall the lions and the bears. So David is talking in camp, asking questions, and word gets to King Saul that David is inquiring about this giant. So Saul calls him in. It's like, okay, why are you asking about this? What's going on? And David said, I'll go fight him. I'll go. I mean, he's 15, 16 years old at the time. He said, I'm going to do it. Saul's response was, don't be ridiculous. You're an idiot. This is foolishness. But David began to testify. David began to give a word of testimony about what he had experienced. Some of you need to rise up with you. You overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of your testimony. Some of you need to revisit testifying what the Lord has done. And so this is what it says happens. But David persisted. I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats. Just another little point. David was faithful. He was just committed to what was in front of him. And he said, when a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and I rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw, another translation says by the beard, and I club it to death. Once again, volatile. I have done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too. I got a testimony. I got a rear view mirror, and in it I see that the power of God has always been faithful to me. You know, when there's a giant in your way, it can obstruct your view of the future. When you're dealing with an adversary, when you're dealing with opposition, it can make it hard to see with vision into God's future for you because that thing is just standing right in your way. And when you are dealing with a giant, it can block out the sun and make your present feel very dark. It can cover you in the present in darkness. But I want you to hear this. When it's tough to see a bright future, when it feels like you're living presently in dark days, I assure you, somewhere in your past, the sun is shining. The enemy can make it difficult to see the future. He can make the present feel dark, but he can't touch your past. And if you could develop the discipline of looking back into your life and saying, I might be dealing with something right here, but I have some history with God where I have seen Him give me a victory. And I believe, even though it's hard to see ahead, even though it feels dark now, the sun is shining brightly in my past. And if He did it then, I have a feeling He can do it again. If He was committed to me then, He's probably committed to me right here and right now. Some of you got a story, but you become so obsessed, so fixated on your present circumstances that you have forgotten to reach back with gratitude and faith that God has helped you kill some lions. And there's lions and bears laying all over the ground in your past. You've got a victory resume with the Lord. You didn't think you'd survive that divorce, but here you are. You didn't think you'd come out of that health crisis, but you are still alive and well. You didn't think you'd beat that addiction, but here you are clean and sober. You didn't think you'd come out of that emotional despair. You thought the pain would never end. It lasted so long, but here you are, and it ain't on you anymore. Like you are a living example that God is always coming through. And for some of you, when you're going through it, the first weapon in your repertoire needs to be to remind yourself of the faithfulness and the goodness. How many of you got something back there that you got? Why don't you just go ahead and thank Him for it right now? I got something back there. I got a lion, I got a bear. God gave me the victory. He got me through that. You got to have the grit. When you can't see the future and the present feels bleak, you got to have the grit to force your eyes onto your testimony and to the great things He has done. And the fourth one is remember, the giant is defying the Lord, not you. The giant is coming against God, not you. You know, David and Goliath, that story is not about the Philistines against the Israelites. It's not a story about David versus Goliath. It's actually a story of the serpent in Genesis against the son that shows up in Matthew. That's what it's really about. There was a time in the New Testament where there was a man named Bartimaeus who was blind. And as he was on the street being passed by the throngs of people, he cried out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Calling to Jesus because Jesus came in the line of David. Don't think for a moment that as Goliath was staring down David that the enemy wasn't after the seed that was Jesus to come. The enemy was trying to stop what God wanted to do in the earth. The enemy was trying to stop the glory of God from being manifest in the world. That's what the enemy was after. You and I are just the battleground at times. We're just the staging point. But what's really going on is the enemy does not want what God is trying to get through you into the earth. So he will mess with you and harass you to try to stop God's plan. It's what David said. You've defied the Lord. You've defied the God of Israel. This is not an attack on me. It's an attack on God through me. And what that should do in you is instill in you incredible confidence. Because if this is really about what God's trying to do and not about me, then God has a vested interest in the occasion. That God has a commitment to the battle. That God has some spoils that He's winning in the battle too. That God is determined that the enemy will not rob Him of any glory. That you're not in that valley alone. Even though the enemy thought he drug you down to his level, isolated, you are standing there with the God of the universe on your side, fighting victoriously. There should be something that's stirred on the inside of you that says, I'm not in this alone. This ain't even about me. This is about God getting the glory through my life, and the Lord will come to my aid. He will rise up defenses on my behalf. He'll get the job done. And so today I believe the Lord wants to do miracles in the house. We prayed to that end this morning. It's been in my spirit all week that we're going to pray for folks today. You're going to get home and you're going to get phone calls. You're going to get texts. Your body's going to shift. Your finances are going to turn. A check's going to hit the mail. Like that, God is going to give some victories today. You say, well, I don't need one right now. That's all right. God equipped you today because something's coming. But you're ready for it now. You ain't going to run from it. You're going to run to it. I want you to close your eyes for a moment.